So I'm very excited to chat with you, Midge. I've interviewed you at least twice about Band-Aid and Do They Know It's Christmas. So like full disclosure, we may get to that at some point during this interview, obviously, because it's it's like the 40th anniversary of Do They Know It's Christmas this year. But there's a lot of other stuff to talk about because this Band in a Box tour you're doing is an overview of your not entire catalog, but a lot of your catalog. And I'm gonna go see you at Zebulon, and I admit I did look at the set list. I spoiled it because I wanted to get an idea of what you're doing. There was no Do They Know It's Christmas on there. We'll talk about that later. I want to talk about Band in a Box and like what the concept is. It's not exactly a one-man band, but it's pretty close to it.
Yeah, just double that. Yeah, it's a two-man band.
Two-man
So
band.
yeah, it was born out of necessity, really. My old friend Howard Jones came to me a couple of years ago and wanted to do a tour that was kind of electronic heavy. And he wanted me to go out there with a full-blown band, and I had to explain to him the fiscal problems of doing something like that. Howard was commercially successful in America, much more so than I was or Ultravox was. So we came up with this hybrid, where I would use his keyboard player as the main keyboard player, and I would program some drums and synthesize bass and play keys and guitar. And I was reticent about doing it because it kind of felt a bit, I don't know, is it karaoke or is it live? I'm not sure. And it's not something that sat well with me until we did it. And the response from the audience was spectacular because they got to hear something that was as close as they were ever going to hear to what Ultravox would have sounded like, or Visage might have sounded like had we performed live. So the response was great, and it waylaid any fears that I had of doing it. So it's taken 2 years now to get the time to come back again in that format and perform. So it's working incredibly well.
Does it sort of feel full circle or going back to your roots or whatever? Like when you were one of the very early adopters of, if I'm understanding correctly, of like synthesizers. I think around the time you started doing them, there were probably people who were like, what's this flash in the pan? Or, that's not real music, or whatever people were saying about synthesizers or electronic music at the time. And you were kind of at the forefront of being able to do it DIY style. So like it's sort of returned to that, right?
It's kind of gone round, yeah, full circle. Yes, that's the way life tends to be, isn't it? You know what? Yeah, I bought a synthesizer in 1978 and introduced it to the rich kids with a view to utilizing this new instrument that was as limited as your imagination in amongst traditional rock instruments, guitars, bass, and drums and whatever. And it immediately broke the band in half. And
Really?
yeah, half the band who liked it, that was the drummer, Rusty Egan, and myself, took the synthesizer and created Visage. We
Mm.
put together a studio concept of working with our favorite musicians, one of whom happened to be the keyboard player in Ultravox. And during the Visage recordings, in the dying throes of the rich kids, we saw Ultravox come to America, do a tour, and come back half a band. The singer left, the guitarist left. They've been dropped by the record label. And I jumped at the chance of joining
Replacing
the John
on
Fox. Yeah.
Fox, yeah. How
And
did that come to be? I mean, obviously, real synth heads know about the John Fox era of
mm,
Ultravox, but when you joined Ultravox, and obviously MTV was happening here in America and stuff. My impression, my memories, when you joined Ultravox, that's what catapulted them. I know you say they weren't that big here, but to me, growing up with MTV and seeing Vienna and Reap the Wild Wind, I mean, and also growing up in LA with K Rock, Ultravox were a big band to me here, and it was your era of Ultravox.
yeah, the coasts were great for us. Probably the big bit in the middle wasn't so welcoming.
Okay.
You've got to imagine, you've got to remember, 1979 or 1980 was the first time I came to America with Ultravox, and you still had stations that played Stairway to Heaven 24/7, and Styx and Boston and Foreigner and the American kind of corporate poodle rock stuff. Nothing wrong with it, absolutely fine. But for us to expect that kind of audience to adapt and listen to what we were doing, which was it must have been like we just arrived from Mars. It was so alien
That's
to
what
people.
made it exciting to
It was
me.
what made it exciting, and it made it exciting for me as well. But it was difficult. So that yes, the coasts, you had a handful of stations that could play or would play that stuff, as well as all the college stations. So yes, in Los Angeles, K-Rock, 91X, those stations would play a lot of the new wave that was coming out of the UK. So that was fine. But it was an exciting period, not just musically, but technologically as well.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
sort of,
you had these instruments that could do just about anything. They were just difficult to tour with. It was a bit of a nightmare. Our sound checks used to take 5 hours.
they were really heavy, right? Those synthesizers.
And we adapted everything we had to make them do what we needed them to do, which meant we had to carry two of everything. So in case one broke, you couldn't just rent one because it was altered. So it was a technological nightmare. But the noise we made, the sound we made was fantastic.
So I'd love to just talk a little bit more about, you were saying how the synthesizer, your adaptation of the synthesizer split up or fragmented the rich kids. When you decided to explore this new technology, like what made you want to do it? Were you like, this is the future, this is the new punk rock, this is the new frontier? I've talked a little bit with some other people, like actually I have talked with Howard Jones about this, and I've talked about Gary Newman with this, who was very early on, and how, it fractured his fan base at the time when he went in that direction. But like, what made you want to, at the time it might have seemed like a risk. Like I said, other people saying this is a novelty thing or this isn't real music or whatever, but you must have had some vision that it was the
Well, I
future.
think you've got to remember that when the saxophone came out at first, the people in orchestras and big bands thought it was a joke.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, yeah, they thought it wasn't a real instrument, a real brass instrument. Yes, the synthesizer did kind of divide people. It was seen as a novelty instrument. It was a funny noise you put on your record. But because of the clubs that we were associated with in London, Rusty Egan ran a little club called Billy's, which was the forerunner to the Blitz Club. So he was responsible for a lot of the music coming out of Europe, getting played in those little clubs. So he would play early Ultravox. He would play early Gary Newman. He'd play early Depeche Mode or Heaven 17 or Human League or whatever. Uh, in amongst Kraftwerk and Le Dusseldorf and Neu and Can and Roxy Music and David Bowie. And that was it. It was a Bowie night, they called it. But it had all this electronic stuff. And when you heard the sound of these instruments, drum machines, sounds that they weren't drums. They replaced what a drum would sound like, but the sonic element of it coming out those sound systems was immense. It was amazing. So we were very influenced by that and wanted to generate music to play in clubs. That was it, not to make music that was going to be revolutionary or groundbreaking. We wanted to make music that we could play in Billy's and eventually the Blitz. That was it. Then, of course, the fashions became high street fashions, and that music was everyone dropped the guitars and bought synthesizers. So it was a revolution with technology and fashion and music all at the same time. So it was a kind of a little social explosion.
It was a very exciting time. You mentioned the divide in the rich kids. So was Glenn Matlock on the anti-synthesizer side? Did he later say like, hey, you were onto something there? Like you
Did
knew what you were
yes,
doing.
he did. He did. That's just understandable. It was such a divisional thing. If you weren't interested in it, Glenn's very much a plug in and rock and roll guy. Plug in, just hammer it out, and it was loose and the Rich Kids were a great band. It was great fun playing with them. But it seemed again for him it was quite an alien thing. And Steve, the guitar player, didn't like the idea of it at all. But yeah, no one's got foresight. We did what we felt was interesting at the time, not expecting it to kind of tilt the world on its axis.
Am I, did I imagine this, or was there, you weren't in the Sex Pistols officially, but didn't you have an opportunity to be in them or something like that?
Yeah, back in 1976, I think it was. I was stopped in the streets of Glasgow, my hometown, by Bernie Rhodes, who went on to manage the Clash.
Wow.
I didn't know who he was. He was English, and he was stopping me in the streets, and I thought it was something to do with, you know, borrowing equipment, because in Glasgow at the time, when bands came to play, you couldn't just rent a guitar or an amplifier. And I thought he was coming to me in this music shop where I always hung out. And anyway, he took me round the corner to meet his friend Malcolm McLaren, and he proceeded to tell me about the New York Dolls, his association with the New York Dolls, Vivian Westwood, his fashion, the clothes, the design, his
I'm wearing a
shop.
Vivian. I'm wearing a Vivian necklace right now. Yeah,
Hey, you are. Yeah,
I
that's lovely.
am. Yeah, that
Uh,
was an exciting time as well.
yeah, it was a great time. But then he said he was putting his band together, and would I join the band? But he hadn't asked if I was a musician. And I said no. So I have no idea whether he wanted me to be the singer or the drummer or the guitarist or whatever. So I just said, no, I've got my own band. Thanks very much. It just seemed he was looking for something to, I think, probably help sell Vivian's clothes. So I declined it, but then later on realized it was a Sex Pistols he was putting together.
Did you ever have a chance to, I mean, I assume you must have crossed paths with Malcolm again over the years. Did you ever?
I didn't. I know I
Oh,
didn't. I didn't. But I know it's the case. I did Jonesy's jukebox, Steve Jones's thing a few years ago, and that was hysterical. I told him the stories about it. I told him that I turned down the Pistols. He said, "I know." I said, "But I turned down the Pistols." But why Malcolm was there in Glasgow was that he had slightly hot equipment that he was selling from the boot of from the trunk of his car. And I turned down the Pistols, but I bought an amplifier. And Jonesy was so incensed. He said, I stole that amplifier, and he sold it and kept the money.
oh my God, that's an amazing story. Well, I've got to ask, since he stopped you on the street, not even knowing if you played anything, and you seem like a good poster boy for the Vivian Westwood look. What were you wearing when he stopped you in the street? What was it about you that made him go, that looks like a rock star?
Well, when I had a kind of James Dean quiff, and wearing kind of 50s clothes at a time when everyone else was wearing flared trousers,
Mm.
straight trousers. So I think they just liked the look rather than any technical ability. That I think maybe they thought that would come later. So who
I
knows?
mean, it obviously did. He had some instinct. So you mentioned the Blitz Club and Visage. Am I pronouncing it right? I've always said Visage, but you said it a little differently. Have I been saying it wrong this whole
I
time?
think we just say it differently. The Visage, we say.
Okay, I'm gonna say it like you say it because you're authority. Visage. Um, the Blitz Club, I've often said if I could ever time travel, if someone's like, there's a time machine over there, I would go to the Blitz Club.
Yeah.
Like it just, everything I've seen. I've also, I don't know if you've seen the really excellent Spandau Ballet documentary, Soul Boys of the Western World. It has a lot of Blitz Club in there because, that's where they got their start. It just seems so exciting. And maybe in England it's different, but I don't think Steve Strange gets any credit here for how, he set, in my opinion, set the template for so much important music and fashion. What was that era like? What was it like being take me to the Blitz Club? Put me in the time machine. I want to know what it's like.
All right. Well, you had to be in the know to be allowed in. So Steve had a very strong door policy that if you didn't look the part, you weren't coming in. So people, kids with absolutely nothing, they had no money, nothing. It was a very dismal time in UK social history. 3-day working week. It was very tough. But these kids would go and raid their grandmother's wardrobes and put on a ball gown or a dress and just push the boundaries and go down to this club and dance to that type of music, kind of electronics and stuff. And they were the kids who had started the whole punk scene. And because their younger siblings, were getting into the kind of new wave punk thing, they didn't want to be associated with what their younger brother or sister wanted. So they reverted back to their first love, which would have been T-Rex, David Bowie, Roxy Music. So they went to these clubs dolled up, looking fabulous. All the guys all looked great with slick back hair, and everyone was there kind of posing. It was voguing before voguing became a thing, I
Mm.
suppose. And it was a tiny little club. It's a wine bar in Covent Garden in London, but it was a themed 1940s kind of, hence Blitz, a 1940s kind of themed thing. And these people were just so incredibly cool, listening to this fabulous music, dancing and just having a great time with the minimal amount of spend that you could have. You'd buy a little can of beer and that you'd hold this all night. You'd make it last the evening. So it was incredibly basic, but those those environments are inviting to a certain type of person. So the St. Martin's School of Art, there would be all the kids, the graphic designers would be there, the fashion designers would be there. So you could look round the room and you'd see if there's a future film director and there's a future fashionista and there's someone who's going to design hats and someone who does brilliant graphics. And it was just this little boiling pot of creativity. And it was great because it was all very cool until the night that David Bowie walked in and these kids just turned into headless chickens. They were all running around because the master had turned up. And it was just glorious. The whole thing was great. It was a fantastic little period in time, but only lasted a couple of years.
Is that how some of the Blitz kids, sorry, Blitz kids, ended up in the Ashes to Ashes video? Was he like talent scouting to cast that?
I think he'd heard it. Boy's ear to the ground was amazing. He knew about what was going on, and he wanted to check it out for himself. And that evening, Steve and a couple of others were dragged off to Beachy Head somewhere down near Brighton to shoot the Ashes to Ashes videos, dressed as they were in the club that night. These kind of weird, kind of Greek priests' outfits or whatever. It got completely OTT. But yes, so Bowie saw something happening there and wanted to, kind of be a magpie and just take some of that for himself, which is brilliant. That's the way it should be.
So what was a typical outfit that you wore when
Oh,
you
I,
went
I
to the
was I
Blitz?
was I was never particularly outrageous. We wore dead men's clothes. So you'd go to the thrift stores because again, we hadn't made any money at this point. We were, I was in Ultravox and I was putting Visage together, but it would be a couple of years down the line before you could afford to buy, a Vivian Westwood necklace. So it was not going to happen for a while.
I did
So
get this on Depop, by the way, but there was no, but there was no Depop or eBay or Poshmark
no, no,
or
no, none of
internet
that.
back then. You had to,
Well,
you had to dig.
you had to go and scour the thrift stores and the secondhand shops, and back then you could still buy like a D-mob suit. After young guys had done their 2 years in the army or whatever, they'd be given a double-breasted suit and a shirt and a tie, and you could still pick up these fantastic, wonderful pieces of clothing for very little, and that's what I tended to wear down there. So it was kind of if you think of the Blitz as like the original Blade Runner, was it in the past or was it in the future? Because at the foot in both camps, people looked like they were dressed in 1940s and 1950s clothes, but they were listening to music that was coming from the future and dancing to it. So it was this weird hybrid. And I think maybe that's what made it kind of unique.
It was very unique. So Visage, I'm pronouncing it correctly. I am very fascinated with that whole thing. Like I said, I spoiled myself. I won't spoil it for the people watching this, but there's at least one song. I think people could probably figure out what it is. That's on the Band in a Box set list.
Mm.
How did that band, like, what was the process in which Steve Strange became the face of the band, was he the club owner first, or what was the timeline of that?
Well, it's Steve and Rusty Egan, the drummer from the Rich Kids, who also liked the synthesizer. We put Visage together using our favorite musicians, Billy Curry from the band Ultravox, prior to me joining, the guys from the band Magazine. And we needed a singer. And Rusty said, "Well, Steve, he's my flatmate. He was in a band. I'm sure he'd love to do it." And at this point, Steve was still him and Rusty were running Billy's, so they were the face of that. And Steve had already become the kind of the figurehead of this little movement that was happening. So because we were all in different bands, all still touring at the time, someone had to be the face, the nucleus, the middle person, the middleman. And Steve was more than happy to do that. So we used to send Steve off with the dancers, two backing vocalists, and they'd go and do the television shows and whatever, and I would do all the work in the studio, kind of producing the music. But it took a long time to put it together because trying to get three different bands, still active bands, in the country at the same time, to grab a couple of hours or a couple of days to go and write and record a track for the Visage album. It took over a year before the
Wow.
first Visage album was complete. Begging and borrowing and stealing studio time to do this, and it was over that year of putting the Visage thing together that I went on tour with Thin Lizzy. I'd just joined Ultravox. Billy, the keyboard player, went on tour with Gary Newman. And that gave us the wherewithal to come back and put the money into Ultravox to buy the equipment we needed for this to happen. But it was by that point, Fade to Grey was in its infancy. Billy came back from the Gary Newman tour with this piece of music that he'd been jamming at sound checks, and he'd recorded it with one of Gary's keyboard players.
Wow.
And I had pointed out that we were short of a track on the first Visage album. And if you gave me that piece of music, I'd alter it and write a melody and some lyrics for it. And when we recorded that tune, we knew that something magical had happened. We just created something that was kind of seismic.
Wow.
And it still stands the test of time, which is quite incredible.
Have you seen Violet Chachki's cover of it? Do you know who Violet
No,
Chachki is?
no.
Violet Chachki is the winner of RuPaul's Drag Race season 7.
Oh, well.
She's very high fashion and she's very cool. And she'll sometimes like do stuff where she's dressed as Mark Almond, or she'll do, a Susie makeup tutorial. She's young, but she knows that era. She full on covered Fade to Gray. Like, go
Wow.
on YouTube after this interview, like full on did a video for it that looks like it could have been made in 1981 or two. Like, she became my favorite RuPaul's Drag Race winner after that. But like, just if you don't know about that, you should check it out, because
I'm
talk
going to
about a
check that
song,
out.
talk about a song, transcending generations and stuff. Um, anyway, so yes, fun fact, pro tip. But you mentioned Thin Lizzy just now.
Hmm.
I don't think, well, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who do know it, but I think there are a lot of people that don't know you were ever associated with that band, or certainly would be surprised, because, you were sort of talking about the old school rock, and then when synthesizers came around, and like people just wouldn't associate you with Thin Lizzy. But obviously it worked very well. I mean, you had a collaborative relationship with Phil, that like you did the Top of the Pop song and all this. How did that come about? Because if I'm understanding the timeline here, at one point it seems like you were in Visage, Ultravox, and Thin Lizzy at, if not
Same
the same
time.
time, at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
that's a CV right there.
Well, it's a bizarre one. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because music and people evolve. I bought the synthesizer in '79 in the Rich Kids, and that grew into Visage. And out of Visage, over that year period, I ended up joining Ultravox, which I was desperate to do. I mean, Ultravox had just been dropped by the record label. John wasn't there, the guitarist wasn't there. It looked as though it was finished. It was wiped out, never going to happen. And I leapt at the chance of joining the band. In fact, it was Rusty Egan who suggested to Billy that I was the guy that they needed. So I just joined Ultravox and really enthusiastic about it, really excited about this. All of a sudden, the shackles were off. I wasn't thinking of writing 3-minute pop songs. I was creating music that had no limits at all. And I got the phone call from Phil Lynott. I was in the studio putting the finishing touches to Fade to Grey for Visage. I was part of Ultravox, and he phoned up and said, we're on tour with Journey with special guests. Gary Moore has left the band. Can you fly over tomorrow and do the tour? And I had never been to America. And I
Wow.
thought, this is great. I mean, what a wonderful thing to do. I was just finishing the album, so I tied up my loose ends there. And I went off to America, learned set on the plane and in the hotel room the night before doing the first show, and then played to 30,000 people. Uh, you know, but the wonderful thing was that Philip was a friend, and when he would go and do interviews, he'd take me with him.
Oh,
And he'd sit and talk about the new album, and he'd talk about Thin Lizzy, and he'd talk about the tour, and then he'd say, "And you should speak to Midge about Ultravox."
wow.
And which
That's
is
quite
really
lovely.
beautiful, lovely thing to do. So he'd have me talking about Ultravox, explaining that they weren't finished and I joined the band and whatever. So it worked on many, many different levels. But it was only a 3 week thing. I never, I had no intention of ever staying with with Thin Lizzy. My heart was with Ultravox. Even though Thin Lizzy were high in the agenda when it came to popularity, and Ultravox were deemed finished. Ultravox was an exciting thing to be part of.
What made you so, I mean, obviously it's obvious why you'd be so excited to join such a great band, but as you mentioned, they were kind of not in a great place professionally. They'd been dropped.
Hmm.
There's probably a lot of bands don't survive a lead singer leaving,
Hmm.
or the fan base doesn't accept when the lead singer gets replaced. There are obviously exceptions like AC/DC and Van Halen and things like that, but a lot of times it doesn't work out.
Sure.
And yet thought this was like the opportunity of a lifetime, seemingly.
Yeah.
So like why? And other people might have been like, why do you want to join Ultravox? They're finished. They're old news,
Well, you think about it, they had been using technology that I couldn't attain, I couldn't afford. Ultravox had been using drum machines and synthesizers since I think Brian Eno introduced the synthesizer to them on the first album,
Wow.
so mid 70s. So they had knowledge that I wasn't accessing. So to be in with those guys who were so creative at a time when I was like a sponge. I was soaking up, all of their influences, and it felt like, as I said, the shackles were off, the doors had been thrown open, and there was a world there where I thought, I don't have to sit down and try and write commercial hit singles, because that was my attitude at the time. This world enabled me to go in and expand. I mean, right, Vienna was never a radio record. It was never meant to be a radio record. Fate stepped in and turned it into
And then
one.
it was.
And it changed everything. But to me, it was like, wow, I can experiment here. I'm not held by any constraints. So as a musician, I'd found my home.
See, that's
Uh,
very interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just find that very interesting in that was your take. Like, oh, I don't need to be commercial. I don't need to write singles, because I think for someone like myself, outside looking in, I saw it, the what I thought was you came in and then they became a, not like in a sellout way, but like hit a commercial stride, like became a commercial band in your era, because not because you necessarily were angling for commercial success, but maybe just because of like your pop chops or your pop sensibilities.
I think it's that. It's a mixture, isn't it? You change the ingredients of one ingredient in a recipe in a meal, and it tastes different. And for some reason, the three of them and me coming in as the new boy, yeah, there were pop sensibilities, but there were also experimental sensibilities that just gelled. All of a sudden, it all kind of made sense. Way before there's any commercial success. Vienna was the third track from the album or something. So the album had done what it was going to do, and it was quite successful at that level. And then, by some quirk of fate, Vienna started getting played on the radio, and it changed everything. All of a sudden, instead of selling 30,000 albums in total, we were selling 30,000 a day. It was unheard of. And we hadn't backtracked, we hadn't changed anything. And it's weird that in hindsight, you can look back and go, yeah, well, obviously Vienna was going to be a successful record. Oh, if that person who played it the first time on the radio had chosen not to play it, it would never have been heard. So sometimes you are not in control of how these things unfold. You're in control of the music. You're in control of the sleeve, the graphics, the imagery, the video, whatever. But then you hand it across to the machine, and they have to do their job. It only takes one person in a series of cogs,
If
like
only,
me, that
if
doesn't do
only,
the job. Yeah.
if only the DJs hadn't played Joe Dolce, Shut Up or Your Face.
If only the great British record buying public hadn't bought it.
So that's, I know you've talked about this before. It's just like one of those weird trivia things that like Shut Up Your Face is what kept Vienna from going at number 2 instead of number 1. That song was a hit here, by the way,
Oh,
but
was it? Oh my
it
God.
was actually a fairly big novel. I don't know if it went to number 1 here, but it was on the radio a lot. But like, what a strange time that those would occupy the 2 top
Well,
spots.
it reflected the UK charts at the time. There was space for everything, and everything got out there. It was a very mixed up time.
Were you mad about this? Were you like, what the hell? This like
Oh
novelty song is number 1 and we're number
God,
2.
no! You've got to think. I mean, think that we put out this 4 minute long, slow electronic ballad that speeds up in the middle with a viola solo.
Okay.
What chance of getting that to number 2? Were there? None. So it got to number 2, and and maybe because of the ridiculous scenario with being kept off the number 1 spot, people felt it in their hearts. They still talk about it today. That it was some weird, you know, anomaly that happened in the timeline continuum. That this thing happened. So they kind of feel sorry for us. We were ecstatic. We were number 2 in the charts, and as I said, it elevated Ultravox way beyond the club band that we were at the time, and it changed everything, and enabled us to do the follow-up album the way we wanted to do it. The Vienna album, we had 3 weeks to record and mix it and do it all. Whereas the follow-up album, we spent 3 months in the studio, creating it in the studio. Very experimental, very difficult and interesting record to make. So we have to thank Joe Dolce for keeping us at number 2.
Yeah, and he's not on tour doing a catalog, tour of all his work, Joel Dolce in a box. I don't think he had another hit. So, history proved the whoever, history was on your side. Was that follow-up record? That was Quartet you're referring to, right? Was Quartet
No, it
next?
was the follow-up one was Raging Eden.
Oh, sorry about that. But I did want to ask about Quartet because obviously you worked with George Martin on that. And
Yeah,
I've interviewed his son actually, multiple times, about like various Beatles box things he's done. And he was, I believe, in the studio and as a boy, I think, or he was around.
it was.
Uh yeah, he told me that was sort of around the time when he started being his father's ears because I don't know if you were aware. I'm curious if you were aware that George Martin's hearing was starting to go down at that time. Like,
Yeah.
what are your memories of that, of Giles being involved and and also just getting to make a record with George Martin, Sir George Martin. I mean, come on. That's
Well,
amazing.
Ultravox weren't the easiest band in the world to get along with as musicians. I mean, we were fine, but we were very we were sticklers for what we thought was interesting, what we wanted to do. Um, so when we decided we wanted to work with a producer, it had to be someone that commanded huge respect, and George was that. When George would say, and he did it on a couple of occasions, he'd sit around the piano with you and say, "Okay, guys, I think you've said what you need to say here. You're just doing these escalating chord changes at the end of something, and you're making it a 6 minute song instead of a 4 minute song. Maybe you should rethink that." We would take that. Not many people we'd respect and admire enough to take that. But when George suggests it, you go, "Yes, yes, sir." You doff your cap and you tug your forelock. Thank you. So yes, it was an amazing experience working with him and his engineer, Jeff Emmerich, who was the
Mm.
guy who did Sergeant Pepper with him. You think that's the dream team. Why would you even question what these guys are telling you? So although George's hearing was going, because he wasn't going to make an album, he wasn't going to do another record. So he initially turned Ultravox down. It was Giles and I think his sister Lucy Lucy happened to be a big Ultravox fan and talked him into doing it. So we owe a huge debt of gratitude. So although his hearing was going, he had people around him who he trusted. So Jeff was his ears, and Giles, although he was young, was obviously very musical. The apple didn't fall too far from the tree, really, did it? So yeah, it was a fantastic period and a wonderful man to even be associated with. That they're what I call pinch me moments
Yeah.
in your life, in your career. And they don't necessarily have to be the big bits that people see on television or whatever. They tend to happen behind the scenes, you know, doing a duet with Kate Bush, sitting in a studio with Mick Karn, having George Martin knowing your name, those moments, they are magnificent moments. And working with George was one of those.
Were you aware that he was, I don't know how far along his hearing loss was then. I do remember Giles telling me a story that I remember this very specifically in an interview I did with him, where someone said to George, "How's it going in there? Or how's the recording going?" or something like that. And he said, "2 hard-boiled eggs," because he thought the
Me.
person that was you, said
Yeah.
like, "Oh my
Yeah,
God."
It was in Montserrat, and the mixing facility in Montserrat and Air Studios was manual. It wasn't. It was pre-computerized and whatever, and you had to move all the faders with your fingers. And 10, there was 5 of us at the desk, 10 faders each, having to remember to pan and do the EQs and pull the faders up and down at the right time. Old school mixing. And when you would do that, it would usually be the end of the evening, and you would leave the mix set up. You wouldn't dismantle it. You'd leave it set up and listen to it again first thing the next morning before you stripped it all down to start doing the next mix. So that if the vocals weren't loud enough or there was a mistake or something, you could redo it first thing in the morning. And I was in the swimming pool just outside the studio door, and George went in and said, "I'm just going to check the mix." And of course, we don't need to check it. George was doing it, George and Jeff. And as he walked out with his tray, I shouted, "How's it sound, George?" And he said, "Ah, 2 boiled eggs." It was his breakfast tray. And I thought,
Well,
okay. But,
that's so crazy that I brought that up.
yeah, it's bizarre. Yes. So that was the story. But yeah.
But you obviously weren't aware of it, and obviously whatever he
Well, no,
was
no, we were.
dealing.
We were aware of it, and we weren't worried about it because it's not just about the hearing thing. It's his musical abilities were a major thing. His knowledge of not just your musical structure, but technology as well. My big worry was that what if he's not kept up with modern tech stuff, drum machines. We turned up and he knew he'd already got a Lindrum. He knew exactly what he was doing. He'd tested it all out. He'd checked it all. He was working out, to make it sound more human, what kind of delay you'd have to put on the snare to make it sound like a drummer. You think, wow, this guy he was way ahead of the curve.
Wow, that's amazing. So you mentioned pinch me moments, and understandably, that's one of them. I mean, you must have a very long list of pinch me moments with everything you've done in your career, but what are let's just do like, lightning round, like this is your life style. What are some other ones
I,
top of
I think,
mind?
well, as a kid, growing up trying to be a guitar player, the idea of sitting playing guitar with Eric Clapton one on one in Montserrat again would have been completely off the radar. But that was one. Working with Kate, another one. Being on stage with David Bowie, another one.
At Live
Uh,
Aid?
at Princess Trust,
Oh yeah.
one of the Princess Trust concerts. Uh, Bowie and Jagger had just put out a version of Dancing in the Streets, and all the money was going to go to the African Fund, and they decided to turn up at the last minute at the Princess Trust concert to do Dancing in the Streets live. And of course, none of us knew it, so we had to go and learn it in the dressing room very quickly. And to be on stage with him was just wonderful. A moment realized. People people forget that artists are fans. We all get into this industry because we're fans of someone else. And if that fandom ever wanes, it's time to hang up your guitar. You should be standing in the same room as someone else that you admire and be a gibbering wreck. You can talk to them, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I'm not worthy. This is just incredible.
Mm.
So it's that moment, all those little moments that happen that you think, yeah, this is great. I never ever saw this coming.
Well, as I've mentioned, I have interviewed you a couple of times in the past about Do They Know It's Christmas? So I don't really, I'll put a link. Go read these other interviews. We've talked quite at length about the making of that song and what it was like to be in the studio, whatever. And it was fascinating conversation both times. But I haven't really talked to you that much about Live Aid. I mean, talk about a pinch me moment in terms of being around with your heroes. I mean, you were in London, I assume, at the Wembley show, not at the Philadelphia. So Queen and everyone. I mean, too long a list, but like, what are your memories of that in terms of pinch me moments of being like, I can't believe this is happening, that all these people are together, that I'm in the mix of this. I can't imagine, to be honest.
It was too big. It was too large to contemplate. Even though I'd been in all the meetings and all the stuff. 3 months build up to doing Live Aid as a Band Aid trustee. We were overseeing the whole thing. It still didn't feel as though it was going to be real. The only way you could get to Wembley Stadium at that point on the day was by helicopter from Battersea Heliport. So you're flying in over an empty Wembley Stadium with thousands and thousands of people standing outside, just completely encompassing this thing, waiting to go in. And at that moment, it felt like, oh, this is really going to happen. Because in the back of your mind, it's too big, and you think, how are we going to pull this off? So you get there, and everybody you've ever seen in your life or heard the music, whatever, we're all there. It was crazy. And irrespective of what genre of music you thought you belonged to, because there is a divide, a self-inflicted divide. You'd look round the kind of holding area, the green room, and you'd have the rock guys over there, you'd have Paul Weller over there, and you'd have the romantic-y synth guys in the corner. And the moment the thing kicked off with Status Quo rocking all over the world, you looked around the room and everybody's got an inane grin, a stupid look on their face, and the heads are all bopping. You think, okay, the library tag has gone. We're just a bunch of musicians. Status Quo are playing this rock and roll 3-chord. Here we go, and here we go, and here we go. And we're all going, yes, this is real. This is fabulous. And one of the outstanding moments for me was stupid. I was talking to Harvey Goldsmith, who was the guy who put it together with the Band Aid trustee, still a Band Aid trustee. And he was in a real tiz, and he was on the phone, and he's saying, well, I said, what's the problem, Harvey? He said, well, I've lost the shuttles. And I said, well, what shuttle? I thought you meant the shuttle that took you back and forth between the stadium and the dressing room areas. And he said, no, the shuttle. And he pointed up. He said, the space shuttle, one of the astronauts flying overhead was going to announce one of the bands. And I thought, it just doesn't get bigger than that, does it? It's crazy.
Do you know who the shuttle was supposed to introduce?
No, it didn't matter. The fact that they were going to link up to a shuttle that was flying around the Earth to do this was just ludicrous.
I don't know if you've seen the new documentary, it came out this year, The Greatest Night in Pop, which is
Yeah.
about the world. Obviously, there have been documentaries and there's lots of footage of Band Aid and the Do They Know It's Christmas sessions and but has that sparked the success of Greatest Night in Pop, which is up for 3 Emmys this year? Has that sparked, and Bob Geldof's in it, as you know, has that sparked any ideas to maybe with the anniversary of Live Aid or whatever, to do something similar about Band Aid and Live Aid?
Yeah, it's in the process now. They've been delving around trying to find footage. We didn't have the luxury of having a film crew, making us. We didn't. I was stunned at how organized the American one was, because they had plenty of time to do it. Ours had to be done, and we've got a week. We've got whatever it is. 4 days in the studio. I played all the instruments on the record. Doing Bob's idea and my ideas together to come up with the backing track. Bob procured most of the artists, and we had one day with 24 hours where nobody knew the song, of course. No, you couldn't play them the song beforehand. There was no internet, no smartphones, none of that stuff. So we had to teach them a song, record all the individual vocals, record the chorus vocals, record Phil Collins' drums, and then mix the record because it had to be in the pressing plants by 8 o'clock the next morning. But when I saw the documentary on the We Are the World, it was so well organized. It was so it was a luxurious way of doing it. Our one was, we don't have catering, we don't have food, we don't have drinks. If you want to, Boy George flew in late because he was in New York at the time, and he turned up and he had a croaky voice, and he said, "Can I have somebody get me a brandy?" And I had to press the intercom button and say, "There's nothing. We have nothing here. There's no one to get your brandy. We don't have anyone here except the artists. If you want a brandy, you have to pop to the shop round the corner and buy one." And that was the level it was at. So they've desperately been trying to find all the footage from Band-Aid, Band-Aid 20, Band-Aid 30. There's a big mega mix about to come out and done by Trevor Horn, utilizing all of the different mixes and a bunch of new stuff. So you can have various vocalists. It's technology. You can have various
Wait,
vocalists together. So that's all going
wait,
to come out
that's
soon.
happening this year?
It's happening this year, yeah.
Are you mixing the
First
three
person I've
Band-Aids
told.
together? Huh?
Yes, kind of, yes. So you're the first person I've told.
Are you going to use the Dizzy Rascal rap from Band-Aid 20?
There's a bit of that in there as well, yeah.
Oh my God. Strangely, I'm very, very into Band-Aid 20. I'm a very big Darkness fan, and I'm a very big fan of just that era of like the aughts Britpop that was happening at the time, like Turn Breaks and Supergrass and all those bands.
Yeah.
And I don't, in America, at least, like no one knows about that one. I'm sure they know about it in England. I'm sure it was a hit there, but here, like I'm the only person that knows about it. So wait, so you're going to take, and Trevor Horn's amazing, by the way, not to name drop, but I've interviewed him as well. And I mean, talk about amazing producers. So you're going to take all three of those songs and, turn into like Band-Aid 40, I guess.
He's done his magic. He's created this thing, this kind of slightly symphonic, mega extra long thing. It was just wonderful. It's great. It's a great way of celebrating the 40 years, really.
Are there going to be any new British artists, like the Dua Lipas of the world or whatever that are
I don't think so.
newish?
I don't think there's any new stuff going in there. It's a celebration of what's been to this point. But there's always room for the Dua Lipas to grab the baton and do a new version. Every generation should do a version of that song because Bob and I gave the royalties to the Band-Aid Trust. So as the more versions there are of that, the more money it generates for the cause.
That's very exciting news. Completely random, but I've got to ask because it's just sprung to mind. What do you think of the video that Pulp did for Bad Cover Version? Have you ever seen that?
No, I haven't, but I'm sure it's
Okay.
cool.
Besides the Fade to Gray Violet Chachi, it's basically a parody of of Band-Aid with a lot of actually modern day pop stars of that time, like Robbie Williams and Missy Elliott. But the whole like way that the Band-Aid Do They Know It's Christmas video looked kind of sparked a lot of imitations. So
Of
like,
course. It was a template, wasn't it? The crowd all standing with their headphones on, hands on ears, all singing a song they didn't know. Yeah, that's fine.
So one thing, the last question I have about Band-Aid, because like I said, I've spoken about it with you before, but in the two times I've spoken about it with you, you've sort of I wouldn't say disparaged the song, but you sort of like basically said, you don't think it's, one of the quotes you said to me is it's no white Christmas. You don't think it's like the greatest Christmas song of all time, or, it's not certainly probably, correct me if I'm saying anything wrong. Like, if you're looking at your own discography, you don't think it's like the best song you've ever written or anything like that.
No.
As the years go by and it just keeps like this project you just told me about, like, where do you stand with that song now in terms of it as a song, not as a phenomenon or, an historic moment, but just as a song?
As a song, it's okay. It's okay. It's a song with no chorus, and it's crazy that I think had we not had the strength of all those artists to turn it into the three-ring circus that it did turn into, the song would never have seen the light of day. It was okay, but as a record, and I can say this because I'm blowing my own trumpet here, as the initial record, it still works today. There's something about that ominous beginning that makes the hair on your arm stand up every time you hear the multi-track vocals, all of that stuff. It really worked as a record, and it became a phenomenon. But as a song, if you stripped all that away and stripped the social element of it away, and it's just a song, it was okay.
I do have to say, I did actually see you perform it once. If I'm not mistaken, I think you performed it acoustic at the House of Blues in Hollywood. Is this ringing a bell?
That is ringing a bell. Yes,
Because I was
yes.
shocked. I couldn't believe you were doing it. But so I'm putting in the request for you to do it as a 1 or 2 man band. I know that's a lot of voices for you to do.
That is a lot of voices. Yeah.
Putting a request for you to do on the Band in a Box tour. This has been such a lovely conversation. You've been really generous with your time. So I'm gonna let you go. I just have like one more kind of I don't know, it's kind of an odd question, I guess, but like we're talking about all these achievements you've done, I mean, just alone the fact that you wrote and did all the instruments but the drums on Doing the Notes Christmas, but all these bands you were in, sometimes at the same time, all these people you've worked with, Princess Trust or whatever. I mean, you're kind of this person, and I don't mean this in any kind of shady way, but like you've kind of flown under the radar for a lot of people. Everybody knows Ultravox. Everybody, of course, knows Band-Aid, but like maybe they don't even know that you were, the guy,
Mm.
doing so much. Like, yeah, how do you feel about your legacy? Do you like the fact that you're sort of just this kind of like Zelig of pop that, I mean, that's just sort of been there for so many moments, but like, you know, you talked about not being big in America besides the two coasts. Like, how do you feel about your legacy as sort of, you've just kind of always been there doing cool stuff. And I don't know if the average person knows. Maybe they'll know if after they watch this.
You know what? Legacy wise, the only thing you can hope that happens once you're gone is that your family, my daughters, my 4 daughters, can listen to what I've done and think he did the best he could at that moment in time. I've never done anything half-hearted. I've never done anything 50%. I go at things and I do them to a standard that I'm happy with. That's it. And it might not be everyone else's standard, but it's my standard, and I'm content with that. The Zelig part, yes, it has bonuses. You can be the invisible man of rock, which is perfectly okay with me. I got a life in music in a career that is notoriously short-lived. I've gotten what I wished for. I go back home when I'm in Glasgow. If I'm back there and have a few hours, I go back to the streets that I used to walk around as a kid, wishing for what I eventually got. And that keeps my feet in the ground. I get to do what I love. So when people say to me, "You thinking of retiring?" I say, "Well, retiring from what? Surely you retire from something you don't like doing to do something you do like." And I can't find anything better than what I've got.
That's the perfect answer. Walking the streets where Malcolm McLaren once saw you. Probably a good idea you said no to that, because look at the career that unfolded after that.
It could all have gone horribly wrong.
Well, it went wonderfully right, and it was wonderful to kind of just chat about so many different parts of your career, and I'm really looking forward to spanning it when I see you at Zebulon next week.
I'm looking forward to it all.
I'm welcoming you. I'm looking forward to seeing you back on my coast. The
Okay.
coast will
Thank
always
you.
welcome you, Midge. Thank you so much for this chat. It was really nice.
Thank you. Let me into your home.